Hey, InterVarsity alumni. This is After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. This is both an exciting and potentially tricky transition that you're making, and you might feel a little unsure about the coming weeks and months. We're here to provide you with expert advice, practical skills, and plenty of encouragement as you learn how to keep saying yes to Jesus in your new context. This is After 4, and this podcast is for you, alumni. What's up, alumni? Welcome to After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. I'm your host and guide, John Steele. Hey, we're in the middle of a series on navigating conflict, and conflict is one of those things that's just inevitable. You're going to experience it. And in your first year of life after graduation, you might feel kind of short on people to help you navigate it well. So that's why we're doing this series. We want to impart you with skills, tools, frameworks, all the things that you need for navigating the inevitable moments of conflict in your life with grace, humility, and health. Sometimes, though, conflict isn't just conflict. It's actually engaging with an enemy. We learned about the difference between those two things last week with Michelle, and she also helped us start to grapple with the hard reality that there's internal work that needs to happen in me so that I can engage with my enemy in the loving way that Jesus has commanded. This week, we're going to hear a real-life story of someone who did exactly that. Brent Campbell, InterVarsity alumnus and current IV staff, is going to share the story of the day he met his enemies face-to-face, was threatened with death, and chose the way of Jesus in his response. I'll wait and let him share the details. Just a couple of things that I want to let you know first, though. This is going to be a different experience for a couple of reasons. One, this is a two-part episode. It's not unusual for us to have two-part episodes, but we're releasing both parts at the same time. Part 1 is focused on Brent's story specifically, and Part 2 is focused more on what had been happening in the background of Brent's life that made it possible to respond in this way. But I wanted you to be able to take a breath between episodes if you need to, while also being able to jump right into the next one so that the story is still fresh while you listen to Part 2. Another thing that I want to note, you may have noticed that this episode is marked as explicit, and that's a first for us here on After 4, so I wanted to speak to that directly. As you listen, you're going to hear some strong, difficult language along the way, and I want you to be prepared for that. Brent's story involves moments of racist, hateful speech and harsh profanity being directed at him. There's threats of physical violence and even murder, and it involves a story of contemplated and nearly attempted suicide. And Brent asked if he should censor himself as he told this story, and we agreed to just let the story unfold naturally. Whatever was said, and then Brent gave me permission to make final calls on any editing and censoring that might feel necessary. Ultimately, though, I decided to leave his story uncensored and uncut, and I did that for two reasons. One, I think hearing some of the harsh realities of this story adds important weight to the decision that Brent made to love his enemies, when he was treated as subhuman, when his life was threatened, and when no one would have blamed him for responding to hate with retribution and retaliation. Brent, instead, chose the way of Jesus. His unedited story communicates that in such an unmistakable way. So that's one reason that we left it. The second reason is that as a white host, producer, and editor who's been entrusted to steward this story well, it felt pretty tone deaf to me, tone deaf at best, to be the one to censor anything from it. So that's the other reason that we decided to just leave it as is. One last thing, given that this is also part of Brent's story, if you or someone you know is suffering from thoughts or attempts of suicide or self-harm, or if you find yourself in an abusive or otherwise unsafe situation, please call or text the number 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. There's more information in the show notes. Please find help today, friends, if you need it. All right, that's enough from me. Let's jump into Brent's amazing story. Here he is. This is Brent, and this one's for you, alumni. Brent, welcome to the podcast.
What's up, John? Thanks, man.
So glad that you could be here. I'm excited for us to get to hang out a little bit together, and I'm grateful for you joining today and being willing to share your story. As we jump in, before we dive head first into this story, though, man, Brent, would you just help us get to know you a little bit? Give us an introduction.
Yeah, Brent Campbell, I've been on staff with InterVarsity for last decade, give or take a year. Been married for 4 years to my wife, Brittany. I've been recently made into a father of a son named Noah.
Wow.
He's so cute.
Congratulations.
He's so cute. Um, he is a beautiful inconvenience.
Yes. What a great way to put that.
That's exactly what he is. That's exactly what he is. God had to make him so cute, so to override the inconvenience factor. So we're living all of that. And what else? I'm one of those people who has never doubted or questioned my time on staff doing full time ministry. There's nothing else I would like to do. Um, and I just feel grateful. I increasingly grateful to the Lord that I get to do. I get to make money doing this, even if it's not that much money.
Yeah, right.
But that I can provide, for my family and have a living doing this. It's astounding to me, and so I could say more because I always can, but that's enough.
Yeah, that's awesome. Oh man. Well, I mean, blessings as you are navigating these early days of parenthood, and I have 2 kids myself. It is quite a season to be in, those early months where everything is constantly changing.
If you hear anything, I have my first baby, my baby born illness is my first one, and it's exciting.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, we'll trust in the Lord's provision for a voice today as we jump in together. Yeah, man. Brent, just to set the scene for you a little bit. This podcast is for new alumni, people who have just graduated or who are anticipating graduation, and we're helping them navigate that transition. And we are in a series that's talking about conflict, about dissonance, about engaging with people that we might even consider our enemies at one time or another, or for one reason or another, and how to navigate those relationships. And so we want to equip listeners for challenging experiences, knowing that they are absolutely going to step into conflict in life after graduation. We want them to be prepared for challenge, but we also want to provide hope. And I mean, that's part of the reason that I was really hopeful that you were going to join us today, and I'm excited that you're joining us because I think that you have a story that walks that line of this was challenge and conflict don't even feel like the right words, but those are the words that I have to offer. I'll let you pick different words in just a little bit here, but significant conflict, significant dissonance, and also significant hope. And so I'm really grateful for you joining us today. So Brent, I want to hand things over to you. Would you please set the scene for us? Give us whatever background is helpful, what led up to this moment, and then let's go on a journey together of what happened through this time.
Sure. The year was 2013. It was, it was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
Yes.
Well, actually, so the story, John, that you're alluding to has to do with 5 guys rolled up on me in a pickup truck one day. I was a senior in college, and said they were going to kill me, called me a nigger and a coon, and all these different things. And the long story short, which I'll share some of the long story, but the long story short is I ended up forgiving them. It went viral, I guess, or whatever the 2013 version of viral was.
Right.
And ended up on CNN and a lot of other news sites, and it was just a strange thing because there was a lot of racial tension. That was peak Ferguson, Trayvon Martin. There was like a lot of racial unrest, and it was a very strange, peculiar thing for a young Black kid to forgive a bunch of racist white guys. And so it's a story that's sort of what's the word? It's followed me every year and every year since. So, but before I get into that, it'd be helpful to understand a little bit about me and how I got there. I am the son of pastors. I grew up in North Carolina, effectively in the South. And even though I was the most the most culturally Christian a Christian can be, right? I mean, I grew up in church my whole life, all of my life. Black church, which is not just Sunday. It's it's Sunday for 9 hours. And then it's Monday
Oh
night
man.
prayer, and then it's Wednesday night Bible study. It's Thursday night worship practice. It's Friday night revival service. It's you live in under the church, right? You live under the church. And being a PK, that was certainly my experience.
Wow.
And, my parents are incredible. Um, yeah, I mean, they were such exemplary uh, pillars of Christian faith. It's kind of embarrassing that my faith was so fragile and shallow in light of the examples I had in my life. But all that to say, even though I grew up in the greatest Christian incubator of all time, um, I did not know Jesus. I was a very high functioning Pharisee. Um, if you had told me I didn't know Jesus, I probably would have fought you, and you would have been correct. Um, I I knew maybe of him, but the idea that Jesus was a person was an idea that it was just too hard for me to understand. And long story short, by the time I ended up in college, I had become essentially an agnostic, bordering on atheist, but mostly an agnostic, and was caught up in a relationship I had no business being in. There's always a girl, right? There's a girl in every story. In the Bible, it's the church, and in my life, it was someone else, but there was always a girl.
Hey, you and me both.
And just shouldn't have been in that relationship. And I didn't need God. I had her. She was what brought meaning to my life. She was the stability that rooted everything. She was the reason I was alive and my purpose for existing. And I'm an all or nothing personality, an obsessive personality, and this relationship was really poor for me. And either way, there was no room for God. And long story short, we break up after about 4 years. We date from our junior year in high school to junior year in college. And when I lose her, I lose myself. I lose my grounding for existence. And a lot of the questions I had been asking that had been put on the back burner of, the problem of suffering and evil, the hiddenness of God, a lot of apologetics, really, just questions about faith, the historicity of the Gospels. I knew from the example of my parents that my parents fully believed God was real. I just thought they were wrong. There was so much integrity in my life. I'm like, clearly they believe this. They're just not smart.
Yeah.
They're
Okay.
just not smart.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah.
They're willing to abide questions that I cannot abide, and I just so much the intellectual side of Christianity made no sense to me. And so either way, I am on my way to make a suicide attempt. I had this encounter in my room where I'm talking to myself, and I have this, like, I would call it now like a demonic epiphany, or maybe it was just sense. I was like, man, if God's not real, there's no hope. If there's no hope, there's no point. If there's no point, then I'm wasting my time. And I remember saying, I don't know why more atheists don't kill themselves, but it's either because they're stupid or they're weak.
Wow.
They're either not smart enough to understand the intellectual trajectory of their convictions, or they lack the moral courage to do the thing that makes the most sense. If nothing matters, then nothing matters. Let's get this show on the road. So not everyone falls into nihilism, but I did.
Wow.
And so I decide I'm going to kill myself, and I make a promise essentially to the spirit of my parents. I'm like, I know they'll ask if I prayed or something, they'll wonder. And so I'll just go through the motions and pray. And so either way, I'm on my way to make this suicide attempt, and I have this miraculous encounter with Jesus. God superseded my intellect, the thing I put all my trust in. He just encountered me in such a way I could not explain it intellectually, and I was forced to bow to the idea that there might be someone smarter than me, and maybe that person loved me.
Wow.
And so I became, I got radically, I had a radical transformation in my room alone, July 7th, 2012, at around 7 a.m. No one around. I met Jesus, and my all or nothing personality kicked in. And it was kind of like, Well, before now, I've like everything I've ever thought, I'm an idiot. First of all, I'm stupid. Everything in this book is true. I've proven myself incapable of navigating my own life. Clearly, I'm not doing a good job with this. I should give it to somebody else. And I'm like, I'm gonna I gotta go die for Jesus somewhere. Like I gotta figure this out. And that was
Wow.
so I was always a martyr looking for a cause, and I found one. I get plugged into InterVarsity a month or two later, and by God's grace, really. And there, I encounter the whitest white man of all time, Andrew Gibbons, who is my staff worker, and now he's a AD up in Boston. And he encountered me with a fuller picture of the gospel than I had before, and unknowingly poked at a lot of things in my life. One being my racism towards white people. I hated white people. Grew up hating white people. I had really good reasons for it. At least I convinced myself I did, and I could not put Andrew into a box. He loved me so well. It wasn't possible for me to put him into the category of all the white people, which is the only category I had. And so God used him as hands to sort of redeem white people in my life. He loved the actual hell out of me, and so I owe him everything. All that to say, when about a year later, I'm in this encounter. I ran track in college, and I'm training in the summer alone. And these white guys roll up on me. Actually, I'm resting in between a set, and I hear shouting. Like I have my headphones in, I hear shouting, and I'm like, what is that? And eventually I hear it. It's loud enough that it's cutting through my headphones, and I hear nigger. And I'm like, me, which is really sad. Then I'm like, oh, whoever it is, they must be talking about me.
Wow.
They say it's not what you're called, it's what you're answered to, and I'm not sure what that means. But when I heard nigger, I heard me. So
wow.
I look up, and there's these 5 white guys rolling by in a pickup truck, and they're threatening me and telling me they're going to stomp my nigger ass, and that niggers like me don't belong on their campus, and XYZ, and many more invectives that I could go on and naming. And either way, it was a very scary thing because it's 5 on 1, and they were clearly probably maybe they weren't intoxicated. Maybe they're intoxicated on hate. I don't know. But the point is, they were in an altered state of mind, and I was quite concerned for my safety. And so that encounter lasts for I don't know, maybe 15 minutes. I was convinced that if I responded in any significant way, then things would get physical pretty quickly. So, thankfully, because of Jesus, I did not respond, honestly, because a year prior, I was so full of anger and insecurity. I would have needed to respond. Even if I knew like this is a really bad idea. I would have needed to. But I've been following Jesus for about a year at that point, and so there's this encounter that happens, and they keep driving by to do it again and see if they can get a rise out of me, and I remember talking to Andrew. I'm texting him. I'm like, hey, I'm out here training, and here's what's going on, and these guys, I don't know if I'm safe, but I was like, well, it's just a Tuesday, huh? and I went back to training, honestly, because while that was really significant and a bit scarier than normal, my experience growing up in the South it wasn't the first time I've been called a nigger. Certainly, certainly wasn't the first time I've been threatened, and so it was this more intense situation than normal.
Brent, can I jump in for just a second here and ask a question?
Please.
First question is, I'm assuming that these are not like people that you had any encounters with before this. Like there wasn't some relational breakdown that happened before that caused this hateful outburst. Like this was just
breakdown was I have too much melanin in my skin.
Yeah, right.
I think was the relational breakdown.
So aside from driving by and seeing you, like that was what triggered this moment.
Yeah.
And here, this is also coming off the last year or so of relationship with Andrew, that a huge part of the way that you are encountering Jesus and experiencing discipleship and transformation is the way that you see white people.
Yeah, huge part. Because I didn't even know I hated white people when I became a believer. I was reading through Matthew 5, which is the first mistake. Don't ever read the Bible.
That is a problem.
And I remembered, this is maybe 2 weeks after I became a believer in my room. I'm reading, because now I'm like, the Bible's true.
Yeah.
Previously, the Bible's white noise. I'm like, yeah, whatever. Only stupid people believe the Bible. But now I've met Jesus, and I'm like, man, everything in here is true. This is going to be, how I live my life. And so I'm reading the Bible really for the first time, reading through Matthew 5, and it gets to the part about loving your enemies. And I remember praying after, ending my time in prayer and thanking God that I didn't have any enemies. Hello.
Wow.
I'm like, God, I thank you that that's not me. And I remember very clearly an image comes to my mind. I was a new believer, so this was very strange to me. But I wasn't thinking it. It just came, to me, and it was impressed upon me really strongly, of like a pie chart, and two slices of it were like pristine. It was like filled with this beautiful ethereal light. And the other eight out of the other, 10 slices were filled with like this black sludge. And it was like so striking to me. And I felt like the Lord said to me, Brent, that's your heart. And the black parts of you are the parts devoted to hating white people. I want to live there, but there's no room for me.
Wow.
Right. Very clear. I'm 2 weeks saved. So I'm like, oh, okay, God, I guess, and I remember, word for word, I want to live there, but there's no room for me. And that was when I became aware that I hated white people. I was just in prayer. I'm like, I don't hate white people. And it's like, yeah, you do, and of course there was I remember being 13 at a stoplight, looking to my right, and just normal beautiful day, look to my right, and the guy driving, I'm 13, and he's like, get your eyes off me, you fucking nigger, so
Jeez.
so I
Wow.
grew. That's just how I grew up. I just grew up, and so I have many stories I could share about how I grew up, being a black kid in the South, and so I just hating white people was part of my identity. It was a survival tactic. So yeah, so for the previous year up to this encounter that gets plastered on CNN because I forgive them, is a life of hating, and I've gotten pretty good at it, honestly.
Yeah.
High quality hater of white people here, and
Yeah.
a year of being discipled by a white guy who I cannot put into this box that God is
Wow.
using to redeem the image of humanity, period, but white people in particular,
Yeah.
and the idea of an enemy. So
So Brent, what you said that this happens for like 15 minutes of these guys driving back and forth, yelling these things, trying to get a rise out of you. You know that unless you sort of stay engaged in what you're doing, like responding in any way is going to lead down a road that things are not going to end well. We know, like that's sort of where you left us in the story a few minutes ago, and we know that somehow this ends up on CNN with you forgiving them. Like, how do you get from that moment to like this very public statement of forgiveness? Like, what's happening in your heart? What are the hills and valleys that you come across as you are moving in that direction? Like, fill in that in between time for us.
Yeah, well, so the encounter, sort of happens. I escape. I escape it. I'm walking back to my car. I really decided I wasn't gonna. I had no thought of calling the police or telling anybody. I mean, outside of Andrew, it was just like, as I said, for me, it was like a Tuesday, an intense Tuesday. But it was just like, man, it's not that deep. Sometimes, people are gonna say they hate you and they're gonna kill you or whatever. And I remembered walking back to my car, and I'm crying. I noticed myself crying. It feels like, it's not like I was, I'm crying. I'm like, why am I crying? Because I had made a promise to myself, when I was younger, I would never cry for white people or over what they did to me ever again. As a young boy, ever, 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 ever. I cried way too much. And so that was how I coped. That will never be a way that they control me, is by the way they make me feel, and I will never let them have that control over me again. And so I'm crying. I'm like, man, this is strange. But I'm crying because the guy who was driving the car, sort of the ringleader, he reminds me of someone who's in my InterVarsity chapter, who I have a great friendship with. And my first thought was, concern for him. And I'm like, I love these people. Why do I love these people? It's not fair, So I'm like crying as I have this existential realization of like, man, I love these freaking people. I love white people.
Yeah.
Like the first thing I'm thinking is, oh, that could so easily be, my friend that I know and that I love. Like, and I'm wondering, man, I wonder about their story and like, how did they end up in this place where this is something they're willing to do? And like, I'm like, it's not my normal, and so
Yeah.
I'm just recognizing that, I'm different, and I feel like the Lord tells me I need to tell somebody because I wasn't going to originally. I go to my coach and I'm like, hey, I was working out. This is what happened to me. And long story short, it gets escalated. They're like, hey, this is a hate crime. We need to find these people, and like, all these different things. And eventually gets to the chancellor, and they're like, hey, when we find these people, we're going to prosecute them to the furthest extent of the law. This is, it's dangerous to have these people out here. And if you hadn't responded the way you responded, like, who knows what could have happened, and blah, blah, blah. And I remember just thinking like, well, I don't know if that's really going to help. Like I just remember having that thought of like, well, they'll just be like expelled or they'll go to jail, and then they'll just hate black people more. Like, either way, I was thinking about that, and I went home, and so I wrote a letter to the chancellor and to the sheriff, the head sheriff on campus, saying like, hey, if we find them, they shouldn't be prosecuted. They should be forced to have dinner with me over the next couple of weeks, because and I'm talking about this message of love, and like, this is just people do what people do what they're conditioned to do, right? Like, and love is the thing that shows people a better way. And if we don't show them a better way, like, we're kind of part of the problem. And it happened to me, so normally you'd have to be worried about like, well, that's not very, responsive or sensitive. And it's like, but I'm fine. Like, could we do this instead? I think this would be better. I didn't expect for that letter to get out. It wasn't a public letter. It was a private letter. But the administration was so moved by it, they sent it out to the student body.
Wow.
And from there, it gets to different news orgs. And so it just kind of happened. And I was like, oh. And then people are like, why are you doing this? And I'm like, I'm a Christian. I've read through Matthew 5. I mean, honestly, because I'm a year saved at that point. It's not this, unfortunately, forgiving them was one of the easiest things I did that year. I had to forgive my ex who cheated on me and gave me an STD.
Oh.
After I forgave her, I'm like, I can forgive anybody. You know what I'm saying? It was like, this is not that hard. I had to forgive years and years of nameless white people who I felt, had hurt me, and then I had to forgive the greatest villain of all. I had to forgive myself for not saying no when I was molested, for hurting people out of my own insecurities. This recognition when I came to faith of my own sin, that I was the hardest person to forgive. So by the time I got to the racist white guys, it was like, this is not that difficult. And
been training my whole life for this moment.
Yeah, really. Like, it's like, yo, this is so it was a different thing, and it was weird to me to be publicized in that way, because I felt like I was it felt to me like I was being applauded for not cheating on my wife.
Interesting.
Like, could you imagine a Christian, like, being on CNN and be like, you didn't cheat on your wife this year, tell us the story, And it's like, well, that is the promise that I made. And that's kind of how I felt as a Christian. I'm like, wait, this is weird that a Christian is on TV for doing what Christians are supposed to do. Now, I don't think that way anymore. That was a naive, that was true. It wasn't completely true. It was significant for many different reasons. But at the time, I was just such a young believer. It was so difficult. I'm like, are you saying that even Christians saying like, man, I can't believe you did that, rather than, the end of the parable in Luke where the servants fall down on their feet and say, we have done only what is required of us, But that was my all or nothing. I'm like, I would have, I'd be dead if it wasn't for Jesus. So apparently my way of living life leads to death, and Jesus's way leads to life. And so it was, I'm one of those, I have the personality, if it's not obvious to your listeners, of I have a zealot's martyr's personality. If I'm the sort of person that would do all of the most evil atrocities, I really believe that. I have that personality type. If I can become convinced of an ideology, it's very difficult for me to not take it to the to the extremes. It just so happened that the person who showed up at my room loves his enemies. And so,
wow.
But yeah, that's how I ended up there.
Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, it is as simple. Simple. That's the word. Not easy, but simple. As this is what I've been trained to do. Like this last year in particular, of being trained in the way of following Jesus is a way of forgiving your enemies. And when the initial response from other people is let's prosecute these people to the maximum degree possible, and you say, actually, like what my Jesus would do is die on the cross for that person, instead of prosecuting them to the maximum amount. Like, okay, how do I live that out? And for me, it's like forgiveness and sharing a meal with them, multiple meals with them. So did they agree to doing this with you, of sitting down and hanging out with you? What happened with these people in particular?
Well, they couldn't be found ultimately.
Oh, okay.
It's a little, I don't know, sad. I was sad that I didn't get to. I wanted to have a conversation with them, to let them know that they've been forgiven. Really, I'd seen what forgiveness had done in my own life, freed me from such bondage and darkness.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I was kind of happy that they weren't found, because I think they would have been hurt. My teammates were kind of like, hey, that's great for you, Brent. But when we find them, we're jumping them. That's just how it is, okay?
Yeah.
So there were a lot of people who were really earnest on my own behalf. And so I eventually came to see it as grace, because they know who they are, obviously. And hopefully they believed that what I was saying wasn't some sort of gimmick or ploy. But so no, that never happened. It just became this story. They unfortunately, where I was training is a part of campus where there's like only one camera, so they could see like the front of the car, but they couldn't see anything else, and they couldn't see. It's the very entrance of the campus, so you can't really see where they're going. So it's just kind of like, and there may be some other things. Like it could have taken them a little bit to take the investigation seriously, or there could be other factors, but mostly it was just there just wasn't enough. And anyone who was found could not be. You couldn't. There wasn't any iron shut sort of diagnosis of it was them at this time.
All right, I know that felt like a rather abrupt end, but that's because the story isn't over. There's a second episode available this week, right now, and that episode is Brent explaining more about how this response was even a possibility for him. And I think that part of our conversation is what takes this from a really great story to a challenging but powerful invitation for the rest of us. So I'm not going to offer a big recap or a response just yet. I'm just going to invite you to push play on the second part of my conversation with Brent, which is available right now. I do just want to say this one more time, though, in case you missed it at the beginning, and that's if you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide or self-harm, please seek help immediately. Talk to your pastor, a trusted friend, or a family member, a professional counselor, or call the helpline that's posted in the show notes. And know that you are loved by your Creator and Savior, by the people around you, and by us right here in your InterVarsity alumni team. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you over on the next episode, alumni. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today, alumni. If there was anything that you learned, really enjoyed, or that encouraged you from today's episode, would you send us a DM or tag us in a story? We'd love to hear about it. You can find us at After4Pod on Instagram and Facebook. And if you haven't already, take just a second to unlock your phone and subscribe to the podcast. If your platform lets you, leave us a rating and a review. And if you like what we're doing here, share us with your InterVarsity or other post-graduation friends. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you in the after, alumni.